Hi all, just a note before we get started. This episode of the Art Plus Music Plus Technology podcast is part of a collaboration with Synthopia.com, where we talk to inventors and artists regarding the development of highly expressive MIDI devices. You can listen to this episode from Synthopia, our website, or iTunes, and you can read the interview online at Synthopia.com. I hope that you enjoy this interview with Roger Linn and enjoy the next few podcasts in this collaborative series. So this week, I have a very special guest. My guest is Roger Linn. Now, Roger has had his fingers in practically everything that I think is important in the world. So this is a real big thing for me. I'm talking to like one of my personal rock star bucket list guys. So this is a big deal for me. But I'm going to try and hold it together for the whole hour. So, and with that, I will say hi to Roger. Hi, Roger. How are you?
Hi, Darwin. I didn't realize you were Canadian.
It sounds like it, I know. But I grew up in northern Wisconsin. So I was just on the wrong side of Lake Superior to be Canadian.
I see. Okay.
So let's start off by talking about what you are up to right now, and particularly what you're up to with the Linn instrument, because I believe that's really that's where a lot of your focus is right now, correct?
Yeah, that really is it. It's as I like to think of it, I'm on a quest to rid the musical world of on-off switches.
Well, good for us. That sounds great. I had a chance to actually play the Linn instrument a bit at the last NAMM show. It was really quite an experience and quite different from anything else that I've worked with that is like attempting to do this real expressiveness stuff, because to me it seemed like you made a thing where it had the multiple levels of expression, but it also was discrete. So as an instrumentalist, one of the things I like about sort of the on-off switches is I know when I'm turning something on and I know when I'm turning something off, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't necessarily get that feeling of knowing, exactly the discrete level what you're doing, but you found a way to sort of like make an interface that has that sort of thing that's going to be comfortable to keyboard players, which is like, I know what note I'm hitting, right? But it still has a lot of playability and flexibility. How long did it take to just come up with something that would have that kind of, that feel to it? I mean, it's obviously a part of your design decisions, right?
Well, there was about 4 years of solid development, but before that, I thought about it for a while. I was inspired in part by Lippold Hawkins' wonderful Continuum, which went back to 1999. He was even doing, as I understand it, models of it before then and working on it. But he was, as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I'm aware, the first guy who actually created something that would respond to 3 dimensions of touch polyphonically. Of course, there were others. There were instruments like the EWI in the 70s and 80s, and the EVI, Niall Steiner, and other monophonic expressive instruments that would give you a couple of dimensions, and sometimes 3. But and Don Buchla did some very cool stuff. But I think the Continuum was the first one that really blew it wide open. And so, to give credit where credit is due, he did inspire me quite a bit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, the concept of the multidimensional polyphonic stuff, which is what became MPE, which stands for multidimensional polyphonic expression. The concept behind that is that based off of something that Hawkins did? I mean, I remember he had like a box that would sort of like translate whatever piles of MIDI stuff that thing was putting out and translate it into something that was usable in some cases in the world of CV and in other cases by standard instrumentation. How close was the stuff that he kind of originated to what we're seeing come out now?
Well, I'm not quite sure. I never owned a Continuum. I knew some people that did, and I'm not sure exactly how his protocols worked. But the idea of MPE is primarily to get around the limitation of MIDI of only having one pitch bend or one CC number per channel.
I see. Right. Okay.
So if you want to have MIDI, to its credit, does have polyphonic pressure or polyphonic aftertouch, as they call it. So on one channel, you can have a separate pressure signal for each simultaneous note. But if you wanted to have polyphonic pitch bends, you couldn't do that on one channel. Or if you wanted to have polyphonic y-axis control, forward-backward movement, you also can't do that because you'd have to use a CC, a control change message for that. And so, but in truth, the creators of MIDI, Dave Smith and Roland and the early people that were doing that, kept this in mind, and that was one of the reasons they had 16 channels going over the MIDI cable. So that you could, if you wanted to, have one channel representing one note. And this was primarily at the time to meet the needs of MIDI guitarists. So you could have one string over every channel and get independent bends and vibratos and things.
Yeah, I was gonna say that my recollection was there's even like one special MIDI mode that was sort of oriented towards the needs of the MIDI guitarist, where it was literally channel split by string.
Yeah, they called it MIDI mono mode, and it's otherwise called MIDI mode 4, mono mode 4, something like that. Mm-hmm. MIDI mode 4, and actually that worked fine. I didn't see any reason to change that at all. You know, you don't even need those MIDI mode commands at all. All you really need to do is just send each note on its own MIDI channel.
Right.
When the original spec was created by a group of people led by me and Roland Lamb, who's the founder of Rolly and the main designer of the Seaboard, mm-hmm. When we first created this MPE specification, I just thought, why not just agree on it? Then he felt it would be better to pass it by the MMA. And that was nearly 2 years ago, and the MMA is still debating it at this point. Uh-huh. But basically, it's pretty straightforward. It's just sending a note over each MIDI channel. And the funny thing about it is, while the MMA has been debating it for these past, nearly 2 years, there's about 30 different synths that have already implemented it. And they've done it in a very simple way. They just basically allow each channel to be its own receiver. So if you send one note on that channel, it will be its own unique note. And you send a different note on a different channel, they'll be simultaneous. Or if you send a bunch of notes on one channel, they'll just act like a current single channel synthesizer.
Polysynth, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think it works great just like that. And the only other thing that's in the spec, which I think is optional, is to have one channel reserved as a common channel or a main channel, mm-hmm. so that you can send notes, messages that are common to all notes. But you can do that even if you don't have a main channel anyway, just by saying that any notes that are not the main three dimensions would apply to all voices. Right. So it's a little bit of flux, but all the people that have implemented, or almost all of them, have done it this way, where they just basically if you send a note to a certain channel, it will be independent from notes sent to other channels.
Right. I actually, as part of my work with cycling, I was involved in doing some development with, in my case, what I worked on was an arpeggiator that would work in that kind of environment. And it was really kind of interesting to see the kind of data that would flow through the system, but also the unique challenges that come from saying, wow, I've got these things coming in on all independent channels. It's working with MIDI in a completely different way, but at the same time, it's working within the MIDI spec. So it's not like coming from Mars either, you know?
Yeah.
So you said that you worked with Roland Lamb on this. How long did it take for you guys to kind of hash out what was going to be? Because I assume that everybody comes to a table like that and says, well, my dream of the dream spec of all specs has these 47 things, and another person will have a different 47 things or whatever. How long does it really take to kind of whittle things down to a simple and straightforward spec? Because I would say the MPE thing it's as simple as it needs to be, right? Yeah,
well, I was a big proponent of keeping it simple. You know, some people wanted to put additional things in there, but, you know, that's the democratic process. It just sometimes takes a while through discussion for people to perhaps recognize that what they want could be done in other ways. And then again, sometimes people have some very good ideas that you didn't think of before that really needed to be part of the original agreement. But it ended up being fairly straightforward. And what's very interesting about it is it ended up being, or it is ending up being, because I don't know what's going to end up with the MMA. They don't actually let me participate because I'm not paying them $500 a year for the manufacturer's ID that I haven't used in 20 years. But at any rate, but they're doing a good job with it. And all the different directions they took, what they're finally coming down to is what we suggested in the first place, which was the way interestingly enough, that eMagic Logic team had already decided to do it. They've actually had what they call MIDI mono mode in most of their synthesizers for quite a few years, and before we were even thinking about MPE. And all they did was they have in their ES2 and their sample of the XS24, and now in in 7 of their synthesizers, there's a little, in the lower left-hand corner of the synth window, there's a little triangle. If you click it, a little bit more space opens up to the window, and there's a field called MIDI mono mode. And you can set it to off or on with common channel 1 or on with common channel 16. So if it's on with common channel 1, then channels 2 through 16 are the voice channels. Mm-hmm. If it's on with common channel 16, then the per note channels are 1 through 15. And it's really well thought out the way they did it. Uh-huh. And so we figured, now that we think about it, the way they did it was very good.
That's funny. That's hilarious. That's great. So let's talk a little bit about the Linnstrument itself and your implementation and the kinds of things that you looked at in terms of pushing instrument design. Because from my perspective, when I talk about you being a rock star, for me, and I hope it's not too ridiculous to have me keep on saying that, but I can't help it. But the fact of the matter is, the reason I say that is because you are very thoughtful about how you develop an instrument. I've used the Linn drum. I've used the early Akai drum machines. I've used the Adrenaline. I've always appreciated the kind of thoughtfulness and mindfulness of design that you put into it, because what it seems like is a player designed this. Now, I know that, you're probably not going to consider yourself the world's best drummer or guitar player, or you might be the world's best Linnstrument player. But
no, that would go to Jeremy Kubert.
Okay.
Another fellow, but anyway.
But I'm curious, what is the process that you go through in terms of like validating a design? How do you get to the point where you're comfortable? Because to me, what you're doing is kind of a form of artwork that is really hard to say, this is the thing, because you loving your own artwork is irrelevant, because this has to be played by players. It has to be played by extremely, if anything, extremely opinionated people will put their mitts on your work and decide if it's any good or not. And it seems to me like that has to be an extraordinarily tough thing to do. And I'd like to hear a little bit about your process and how you get to the point that you feel strong enough about an instrument to say, this is the thing.
Well, I like to think of myself as a top-down designer. In other words, I start from the outside in. I draw pictures of it, arrange the controls in Illustrator or something like that, and then I basically just drill down into the inside and make all the parts. And that to me is a much more satisfying experience that I think ends up with a better product. Now, at the same time, there are excellent bottom-up designers that start with a very good circuit, and then once they have the circuit that works, then they create a user interface around it. And there are merits to each, and I try to do a little bit of each. So I'll drill down a little bit, then I'll zoom out, and then zoom in, and zoom out, because everything has to be optimized. And let's face it, it can't be too expensive, or nobody can afford to be able to use the great features it might have or might not have. But what I do, the process I do these days, is I usually start off with Illustrator, Adobe Illustrator, and just arrange some controls around and start off with a parameter list that ends up being a data structure, for example. And I think about how I'd want to use it, and I'll sort of almost touch the knobs on the screen and play with it. And then once I think I've got, in general, what I want, I recreate the same thing in my 3D program, which is Rhino 3D. Right. Rhinoceros, which is a great 3D program. It's not very expensive. It's very free form, so it's good for designers. It lets you get into trouble because it lets you make solids that aren't quite solid or watertight. Right. So you have to be careful about it. But it's kind of like Max MSP. You can easily write spaghetti code in Max MSP.
You do all kinds of bad things, right?
You can, yeah, exactly. You can write, but it's like any language that gives you that flexibility. If you don't have some discipline, it won't produce the best results. But anyway, it really helps me to see it in 3D, and I'll render it and I'll take a look at it. And does it feel right? In looking at it, if I were to approach this thing, would it allow me to make music, which is always, of course, the first goal, and have the technology be secondary? I feel like most of us, people who are playing music with electronic devices, are dragged kicking and screaming into the world of technology. And we'd prefer not to deal with too much of that. So if I can shield people from that, I figured that's the role of the designer. Some people like to make an instrument that has options for absolutely everything under the assumption that you will configure it the way you want. I prefer to think that it's the responsibility of the designer to make some decisions about those defaults so that you can walk up to it and make music. And you mentioned the Kai drum machines I made, the MPC series. Often I would get the compliments from users that they would just take it out of the box, put a sound disc, a floppy disk at the time, into it, load it up, and they just press and record and play. They'd hear the metronome, and the feel was right, the sounds were right, and everything would work. And it reminds me a little bit about what Ray Kurzweil said once when he had the old first Kurzweil keyboards. He said, I'm the only one, which I think is true at the time, who was making a sampler that's not a development system.
Right.
Because he actually took the time to create good recordings of samples that work together well, and so you actually played a complete instrument, whereas others were just making samplers, and you always had to make your own sounds.
Right. Yeah, very interesting. Now, in doing that kind of work, how much, or at what point in the thing do you actually get outside advice? Because I would assume that, especially when you're working on something that is kind of groundbreaking. And again, you've done that a lot. If we go back to the LM1, or if we go back to the early Kai machines, or if we look at the Linstrument, all of these things are designs that are kind of groundbreaking. And so to a certain extent, you have to be careful about, you can't dance in your front yard with it because, you don't want everyone to see what you're up to. But at the same time, you need to get feedback from people that are going to help you refine the design. When does that happen? Who are the kind of people that you talk to? And does that ever get you in trouble? Or does that ever just wave you off of a project completely?
Well, I think I learned early on that I'm often wrong. I often miss the best uses of a machine. And so I recognize that I don't know it all, and I do talk to people and try to get their feedback about it, and it is very, very helpful. Sometimes I want to shield the users too much from technology, and I make it not flexible enough first pass around, and so I learned my lesson through that. But ultimately, I think you find after I talk to people for a while, get feedback, there's a point at which it really starts to feel more right. You always start off also thinking there's a price point I'm trying to hit, because if it's too expensive, people won't be able to buy it. And, I'm not nearly as good as the larger companies at getting low price points. So I choose the place I'm comfortable at, and I try to keep my expenses low so I don't have to sell a boatload of them to be able to make a living. You put all these things together, and there are a number of factors. And for me, it's all kind of in a fog right now, but there's a point at which it all feels right, where you feel like people are going to like what it does for them. They're going to like the interaction. They intuitively feel they know how it works. It's about the right price. It looks pretty. It fits in a backpack, right. Things like that.
So I like this idea of you making design decisions. So often you see if someone would take some of the typical design guidelines and make a guitar, it would have completely optional strings as well as a completely optional number of strings and frets. And that's ridiculous because that's no longer a guitar, right?
Yeah.
And so there is to a certain extent where that kind of design has to, you have to make decisions. That's the job. But now you said something that interests me. You said that there have been times when you've shielded too much. Can you give me an example of something like that?
In the development of Linstrument, I didn't want to have an alphanumeric display on it. So instead what I did was an idea that I was inspired by Lippold Hawken again. He would print the parameters on the upper edge of the continuum. And so what I did is, since I had lights in each of my notepads, I printed parameters above and below. Now, the good thing about this is it allowed me to make the margins very narrow, so you can even strap this thing on with guitar strap pins and play it as almost like sort of a stick would be in
Right.
a near vertical position. But the downside is I had to decide what those parameters were. So fortunately, I'm very lucky to work with an extraordinarily bright guy programmer named Garrett Bevan, who has done a lot of music products. He created software for the Eigenharp. And I had known him because we'd done some talks together and things like that. But I didn't really know how great he was as a software engineer. And at one point, he offered to help me with the software for the instrument because I was fumbling around, not getting it done. I got to the point where it just worked enough to show it at Moogfest a couple of years ago. And then once he started helping with it, the software development went much, much faster. But what's great about Garrett is he understands the context of musical instruments because he's a player himself. Right. So Garrett would often push me in the direction of having more features or more controls, more flexibility. And I had this image in my mind that this thing should just be a musical instrument, and it should allow you to do things like select MIDI channels and that. But I didn't want to get it into something that was too complex and would scare musicians away. So Garrett and I had this very productive banter back and forth, and what we finally ended up with is something that had more flexibility, but by doing deep editing. So the parameters that are printed on the top and bottom of the screen are actually the most useful ones for most musicians. And then you can hold a parameter and then have the screen change to a full screen numeric display that you can slide by swiping left and right. And that allows you into some of the deep editing functions,
You mean the lights on the interface actually become an alphanumeric display?
Yeah, they do, because you've got an 8 by 25 effectively LED display, because you've got 200 of these RGB LEDs, one under each of the 200 notepads. On the panel, it says that the Y-axis can be assigned to either CC1 or CC74. And Garrett said, nah, you need to have it be any CC. So if you hold down the notepad for CC74 for 1/2 second, the screen changes to a big 74, and if you slide your finger left and right on it, you can select any CC. And Garrett said, but it should also select channel pressure and poly pressure. And I tell you, Garrett was right, but we were able to implement it in a way that's a revealed interface, which I think is the important way to do it. You shouldn't have every detail presented in front of you, or else it looks like a cockpit of a plane.
Right.
But you should have the important ones there, and then if you want to dig deeper, you can dig deeper to it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because the idea of a revealed interface is one of those things where that too has to be kind of a designerly thing and kind of a tender dance, because too much stuff is literally going to make the instrument scary.
Yeah.
And not enough stuff is going to make people think it's an inflexible brick. And so coming up with that sweet spot in the middle that's got to be a lot of work in and of itself. I mean, how much of that is something that you gnash your teeth over, and how much of it is just a serendipity of like, well, here's what I decided, and Garrett said it was okay, so let's rock it. How obsessive do you get about that stuff?
Well, I would put it a different way. I really enjoy doing it. I just love working with sometimes I'll sit at night, I may have a cup of tea, and we'd be with my 3D model of a particular product, and I'll be rotating it around, and I'll trying this here, trying that out there, or there might be a knob or a button or something like that. It's fun to try it out and to take the time to allow yourself to allow a certain configuration to feel right. I think I heard a recording of John Cleese talking about writing, in particular his case for comedy or for Monty Python routines. And he said the best creativity comes when you feel you have no time constraints and you can just play. And you get out of that workspace, you get into that play space. Right. Now, it's almost impossible to ever feel like there's no time constraint, but at least I try to do that. For example, I love to wake up on a Saturday morning and play with this sort of stuff because I feel like it's bonus day,
Sure. Okay, but I will just say, just in case you're wondering, people who are obsessed can actually enjoy their obsession. So you have to own that, man, because waking up on a Saturday morning and playing around with parameter listings on the face of your instrument, I think we can all agree that might be obsessive behavior, but we're all also all really happy that you're doing it. So,
Well, here's talk about obsessive. When I was a kid, maybe 10 years old, I had started playing guitar when I was 8 and took guitar lessons. My dad wanted me to play classical guitar because he was a music professor. He taught theory and comp at USC in LA. But I was a Beatles fan, and I loved all those tones that they would get. So I would love to see pictures in magazines of electric guitars and amplifiers. And I never had one for quite a few years, but I sort of drooled over it. And so I thought what I would do would be to write a letter to the Fender company and to the Gibson company and to the Rickenbacker company, the Marshall company, and I asked for their catalogs because that's what you did back then, of course. You'd get a catalog sheet or you'd get a catalog. And I used to just dream about having one of these guitars, and they were magic to me, or the guitar effects pedals or the amplifiers. And what I would actually do, and this was funny, my mom had a little bit of an arts background, so she taught me how to draw a grid on something, to enlarge it, to draw it on a larger piece of paper. So I would take the pictures in the Fender catalog sometimes of like a Stratocaster, and I'd draw a little grid on it with pencil. So the grids were only maybe quarter-inch square. And then I'd take a big sheet of notebook paper and draw the grids at, say, 1 inch square, and I'd copy each one to it. And for me, it was almost like my little, work of art at 10 or 11 years old. But then what I do is I try moving the knob over a little bit. And I said, this guitar has 2 knobs. I'll give it a 3rd knob. And so it's talk about obsessiveness. So I was a nerd at an early age.
Well, let's explore that a little bit, because one of the things I like doing in my podcast is coming to understand how artists and makers and builders, how they've come to be the people that they are. And this sounds like a great start of a story because, quite frankly, it resonates with me. I was one of these kids that, if there was a scuba diving catalog, I would get it, and then the next thing you'd know, I'd have this huge list of all the scuba gear that it would take to have the ultimate system, and I'd be drawing pictures of myself, or whatever, It resonates very much. I'm curious, so you had a father who was a music professor. That had to be a really interesting way to be introduced to music, but how is it that you found that instrument making rather than instrument playing was the thing for you?
Well, I always had an interest in both music and technology. And so it was the marriage of the two. And I think as much as I enjoyed, for example, songwriting or guitar playing, the technology was more fascinating to me because there was a magic inside that I didn't quite understand. And I think also as I grew older, I found out that I was better at the technology part than I was at the playing part. I could never quite get my two hands to agree with each other, whereas the two sides of the brain at least tended to agree with each other in making the products. So.
Right. Well, that's cool. Yeah, it's funny. My left and right work together, but the reason I always failed as a drummer is because my hands and my feet, they don't separate. As soon as my feet have to do something, I start crying. It's which is why I was a fan of your stuff right from the get-go, because it was the way I could drum, right? Was to have a drum machine. Now, as you got involved into technology, because there's a lot of technologies that go into making these products. Now, when I think of you, I think of the LM1 as being kind of the first design of yours. Did you do anything prior to that maybe was labeled by someone else, or was that really your kickoff?
That was the kickoff. When I was in high school, I used to take some of my guitar pedals and modify them. And I didn't really understand electronics very well, so it was kind of on a circuit bending method. There was a guy named Steve Reidinger who had a company called Reidinger and Associates that made guitar pedals. And he had a fuzz box, a distortion box called the Fox Tone Machine, Foxx. And because it was a fuzz box, he covered it in this sort of a velour fuzz sort of finish. And I remember I got one of those, and I found out I had a treble boost, a wah-wah pedal. And when it's fully forward, it's a treble boost. And so I would put that before the Fox Tone Machine, and I got a tone that I really liked. And so I thought, why don't I just take a little treble boost circuit and stick it inside the Fox Tone Machine box, and I drilled a hole in it, put a switch to switch that in or out.
Right.
And it worked. And I learned a bunch of things that either worked or didn't work from things like that. And I actually have no formal training in electronics or engineering, except that when I was in my mid-teens, there was an ad at the back of a popular electronics magazine from a place called Cleveland Institute of Electronics. And it was a correspondence course in electronics. So I signed up for that. And, of course, the ad had a picture of a huge building in Cleveland. Well, there's no huge building. It was a P.O. box
Right.
and one guy that was running it probably, right?
Of course, right.
But anyway, it was well written. I learned electricity was like water from a pipe, things like that. But I learned the basics of electronics. And then past that point, I just read a lot of papers here and there and picked it up. But I still have big holes in my engineering knowledge that I get helped out occasionally from Tom Oberheim or others.
So my question then is, the leap from putting a tone treble booster into a Fox tone, going from there to an LM1 is a pretty big leap. First of all, what part of it was you, and what part of it was people that helped you out, or people that you hired, or people that you collaborated with? I mean, did you focus on the electronics? Did you focus on the firmware? Did you focus on the design? What was the thing that represented the you in the LM1?
Well, I wrote the code for that. And as far as the circuit, I mainly just stole from other people's schematics. And I remember at the time I had a Radio Shack TRS-80, and I got the schematic for that, which was based on the Z80 processor,
right,
which was very popular at the time.
Yeah.
And so I stole the basic computer memory ROM circuit for that. And then I knew I wanted to play back samples because digital sampling was already around because there were digital tape recorders. 3M BBC had a collaborative digital tape recorder. Sony had one. And so the concept of storing audio digitally was already around and commonplace. And I think the one novel idea I had was that if I could just store, even though it was very, very expensive, if I could just store one strike of a bass drum, one strike of a snare drum, it wouldn't take up that much memory. And so I looked around at some circuits for clock generators, chips that would put out the incrementing digital parallel address that would go into the ROM, and then the output of the ROM would go into the D-Day converter. And there were recommended circuits along with these chips. And I would basically take the recommended circuits and then hook them together, and then take the circuit I had stolen from the Radio Shack TRS-80 for the main computer circuit, and learn enough about it here and there. And I'd ask a few questions to a few friends. But basically, the nice thing about these digital circuits, and a true engineer right now is probably throwing up when he hears this. A great engineer like Tom Oberheim or Dave Rossum, these guys who understand the theory down to the fundamental analog level and to the physics of it. But this is the great seduction of designing something in building blocks, as you know, with Max MSP.
As I know, right.
It seems, that's great, I'll just put it all together, and 2 weeks later, you got a rat's nest. So, and I did actually have a rat's nest, because what I didn't understand very well are things like drive current of certain chips. So I had to replace certain chips with bus driver chips. Fortunately, the speed of the chips was slow enough at the time that you couldn't screw too much up as far as, fast edges getting slowed down.
Right.
And so, I asked some people, like the guy who was doing the circuit layout on the circuit board for me, which I didn't know how to do. He gave me some pointers on it, said you got to have a good, strong ground plane and power plane, and then try to keep your higher speed lines as short as possible, right. And things like that. So.
One of the things that everyone says about the various things that you've designed is that the feel, particularly the timing, is very musical. And that's whether we're talking about the way that you did metronomic and swing type timing in the drum machines, the Linn label drum machines, the MPCs. That's always something that people point to as being sort of like a hallmark of your designs. In your mind, what do you attribute that to?
A big part of it is having worked with the musician from the 70s named Leon Russell, who was this guy who was a great pianist and songwriter, and he was a quite popular performer. Well, I used to tour in his band when I was about 20, 21, and when we were off the road in the studio, he had his own studio, And I was sort of his nerd assistant. I could play a little guitar, but I wasn't nearly as good as the guitar players he knew from all his friends in LA and all that. So I would basically play other people's parts on the road. But I would engineer the records because I knew enough about recording. And I was very early on into synthesizers. And he liked that because he wanted to use some of these new sounds, but he didn't understand them quite as well. And so one of the things he taught me was about swing timing, because he understood the concept of a good groove on a recording very, very well, because he had worked with some of the greatest drummers, guys like Jim Keltner, and good bass players, other musicians. And there's this magic that happens when everybody just gels, and you get one of these recordings that just makes people move in the room.
Right.
And so, he taught, one of the things he taught me, he said, some drummers play with a very strict time, and some play with a very mathematically perfect swing, wherein the 16th notes fall on triplets, like. But he said, what really makes it work well and makes the groove work well are the drummers that are somewhere in between. So on the one hand, you've got. On the other one, you've got. Which is basically everything of. But with each note from the triplet removed. But right in between, you've got this. And it's this loose feel. And you can just lean it a little bit from straight 16ths towards swing, and you get a completely different feel. Or if you take the triplet swing and lean a little bit towards straight time, it makes it better. Well, I had those things in the back of my mind. And when I first started writing code for the first LM1, one of the problems I had is memory was very expensive, and I wanted to have 100 drum beats in it, or maybe 88, I forgot what it was. So I wanted to compress the memory, and I thought, well, most drum beats are 8th or 16th notes. So what I'll do is just store 1 byte for each 16th note. And I want to be able to record it in real time because musicians think in real time. So I did this, and lo and behold, when what I entered played back, the timing was corrected. I thought, this is incredibly cool. Because it's hard to play on these buttons with the accuracy that a drummer could on a real drum kit.
Right.
And so I thought, this is a great idea, and I ended up calling it timing correct. The rest of the world subsequently call it quantize. But where swing comes in is I figured, let's see, but Leon used to talk about this bit about swing. Well, all swing is delaying the second 16th note in each 16th note pair. So I decided just to make it variable, or at least there were 6 different increments between. And so I think the combination of the introduction of timing correction or quantize plus swing. And the third thing is dynamics. I recognize that a great groove has to do with many different dynamic levels. And so my compromise was to have, instead of 1 hi-hat button for always 1 level all the time. Now, this is before I created pressure-sensitive pads with the ultimate Linn 9000. But all I had were just buttons at the time. And so I wanted to have 1 button for a loud hit of a hi-hat, for example, a different button for a soft hit. And that way, by hitting them in different orders, like doing a paradiddle on them, you could get things like that. And then you have the open hi-hat as another one, right? So I had 3 levels for the snare, I had 2 levels for the hi-hat, and I had 2 levels for the percussion instruments. And that allowed the combination then of the dynamics, the timing correction, and the swing really allowed you to get very good grooves. And the last thing is I made sure all the samples were very tightly trimmed at the start. So when you hit the button, they played.
Yeah, it wasn't sloppy. Well, this idea of starting by correcting and then loosening up after the fact, I think one of the reasons why people loved those instruments so much is because it was very forgiving for technique, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things, certainly, for me, I did an enormous amount of music using MPCs, and one of the reasons was it allowed me to do that tightening of the timing, but still gave me all of the dynamics using the pressure-sensitive pads, and that was really a key feature. One of the things that happened as a result of your work with all these different devices, development of all these different devices, is that incredible new areas of music showed up. So, I would say that the various Linn drum variants and the Linn 9000 included were really important in the development of a lot of LA-based pop during a certain time period, but also a lot of English and European proto-techno. All that kind of stuff came about because of the development of those instruments. And then your work on the MPC series, I would say almost single-handedly developed the whole world of rap music. You're right dead center in the middle of that. And now, your work on the Tempest sort of extends the field of a lot of certain kinds of techno and electronic music. And now you're coming forward with this new instrument, this highly expressive instrument. And I'm curious, what do you imagine that developing in terms of music? Because it certainly is different. It certainly is yet another groundbreaker. How do you see that affecting music and the way musicians interface with their instruments?
It's a fascinating question, because the way I like to put it is that almost everyone who's playing synthesis right now is playing music on on-off switches. And what I mean by that is a MIDI keyboard is little more than an array of on-off switches. Yes, it's true they're velocity-sensitive on-off switches. And yes, it's true that they have that very limited aftertouch feature, which means that if you press a key down 95% of the way, then it senses the pressure from 95% to 100,
right,
which to me is not terribly useful.
No.
Because they recognize it's not bending notes. They put a little couple of sideways pots on the left side, one for pitch bend and one to introduce a mathematically perfect vibrato. But as we all know, people have tried for 50 years to make those pitch bend and mod wheels do something as natural as the expression of a saxophone or a guitar or a violin, and it hasn't really worked. Jan Hammer did some great stuff in the early days,
right,
but these controls have kind of, in the Darwinism of musical instruments, these particular controllers, the mod wheel and the pitch bend wheel, haven't really turned out very good. They haven't done a great deal. A lot of people since the 70s have tried to put more expression into instruments. Yamaha had some wonderfully expressive instruments. Their wind controllers, Akai had their EWI and EVI, and then Buchla did some wonderful things. And then, of course, in 1999, Lippold Hawken made the Continuum. And I think these will be considered very important stepping stones toward what I call the era of expressive electronic instruments. And this is how I view it. Up till roughly 1970 was the era of expressive acoustic instruments. From about 2020 forward is the era of expressive electronic instruments. And the 50 years in between I refer to as the era of on-off switches. And this is really fascinating. And I have an essay on this on my site. A couple of months ago, in trying to find out if expression was important to people, for a lot of people, I'll play the instrument and they won't get it. They'll say, what's the big deal? I have envelope generators, I've got LFOs. What do I need beyond an on-off switch? Well, it's interesting. 2 months ago, I went to the Billboard Hot 100. This is popular music, and the reason I went there is because this tells me what influences a lot of people, or the listening taste of a lot of people. Popular music, even though I don't really listen to popular music. So I went there, and I looked at the top 20 songs. Now, at this moment in time, 2 or 3 months ago, of those top 20, 18 of them were electronically generated, either all sequences and things like that, or they were hip-hop songs with drum machines and a few other lines, right? And then there were 2 songs made with traditional instruments, either electric guitars or other instruments, or acoustic guitars. The 2 songs that had acoustic instruments, that were made from acoustic instruments, both had an instrumental solo. The 18 songs made with electronic instruments, not a single one of them had an instrumental solo. Now, Darwin, you and I were kids. Just about every song had an instrumental solo.
Right.
There was either a guitar solo on a rock record, or there was thank God there was never a drum solo on a pop record, except for extreme jams,
Right.
Country solo songs had a fiddle solo or a pedal steel solo. Jazz records had a sax solo or a clarinet solo or other instruments, trumpet solo, or they were all solos, right? And there were instrumental stars that you would actually pay to go to a concert where you sit down and listen to an instrumental star play. Now, that doesn't exist anymore. Virtually, it doesn't exist anymore. If someone's playing an electronic instrument, they're either a DJ, where people don't actually go to a concert specifically to listen to them. They go to a dance concert and they dance, and the DJ is providing the background music. Now, it's wonderful background music, but it's still the background music for the event. And it's the same thing in these 18 of the 20 songs on the Billboard Top 20. All the music was background music. It's sequences. It's programmed. And I asked myself, I said, is expression no longer important? But I said, no, that's not the case, because the singers on these songs are wonderfully expressive. They have wonderful variations in timbre, dynamics, pitch, gestures, but all the music is very static. It's programmed music. And then I asked myself, are there no good musicians? No, I don't think that's the case at all. So I think what it is, a part of the answer is all these people who are playing electronic music are playing on on-off switches, and on-off switches are simply not that interesting to listen to.
That's a very interesting thesis. And because while you were talking about that, I was like, yeah, the electronic music doesn't have expressiveness, except it seems to me like, and in different time periods, whether you go back to look at disco or some of the more electronic focused soul music or some of these things, a lot of times it's as things got more strict from a timing and more on-off oriented from the instrument side, it's almost that forced the singers and some of these other musicians to become more or even overly expressive just to almost make up for it.
Yes, that's possibly true.
Yeah, that's a really interesting conjecture. So now, it actually, that kind of answers to one of the questions I was going to have, which was, how much does your experience playing the guitar, and because I didn't realize you had that much experience as a guitarist. I mean, playing with Leon Russell must have been a head spinner. I can't even imagine that. That must have been incredible. But how much is something like the Linn instrument sort of like you taking the feeling and the playability of the guitar and trying to bring that to kind of a MIDI world?
Well, I think I would state it that my goal is to bring the expressiveness of any of the wonderful instruments that we've grown to know and love over the centuries to electronic music. Whether it's guitar or pedal steel or a sax or it's a violin, and I can play a very convincing part on each one of those, and even drums too. I can do excellent drum parts on an instrument, or you can do the same thing on a continuum or on a keyboard. You know, when you've got those three dimensions, it's just amazing how well you can either simulate traditional instruments, or more importantly, create the new sounds, the new instruments that are missing in contemporary music.
As part of developing an instrument, to me, an instrument is the way that you physically interface with the thing, but it's also the sound that comes out. And one of the things I would say is, in a lot of the cases of these MPE capable interfaces, is that it's half of the instrument, right? You have the physical interaction with the instrument, but there's still the sound generating thing on the back end. Now, a lot of people, and in fact, when I tried out your thing at NAMM, I think you too were using the Equator instrument that Rolly has put together, but that to me is about the only, that's where I've seen almost everybody using as a demonstration of these highly expressive interfaces. Do you think that it works to separate the interface from the sound generating device? Or do you think that inevitably there has to be a connection between those two things?
First of all, at NAMM, what I was actually using was a very cool iOS app that Rolly makes called Noise 5D.
Oh, okay.
And it was to
that's right.
to
it was on an iPad. That's right. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and it's great. I mean, it only has presets. You can't edit the sounds,
right.
But there's some wonderful sounds in it. And the beauty of it is MPE. So when you're using it with a polyphonic expression instrument, it will actually play that way. And that was a demonstration of the fact that the instrument can not only play with iOS devices, but you can even power it from an iPhone. Right. It's so power efficient. I would say this. I would love to have a sound generator built into an instrument. And that's where Roley, for example, has an advantage. In their larger instruments, they have a sound generator built in. And Continuum has a built-in instrument. That's the wonderful Egan Matrix software. But I was trying to reduce the price to make it affordable to more musicians. And I talked to people about it, and they said, we've already got all the synths we want. We just want a better man-machine interface. And we don't mind if it doesn't have the sounds built in. Now, I suppose at one point in time, if I could really make a great sound generator that encompassed the best parts of the sound generators that people are using, it would be nice to have it built into an instrument. Mm-hmm. But, the way people make music these days is they tend to make it on the computer. And so if you have sound in the instrument, you can't sequence it in the same way. So there's a lot of advantage to having the sounds in the computer. And the other thing, too, is I found most instrument players, they already have their favorite synths. I could, for example, have a great violin sample, but it's never going to sound nearly as good as the modeled violin from Sample Modeling, right, or any of their modeled orchestral winds or their cello. And I could have some good sample type sounds, but if you're on Mac, for $30 you can get MainStage, and that's going to give you an MPE analog model synthesizer, ES2, an MPE sampler that's very, very capable, the EXS24, an MPE physical modeler, sculpture, an MPE FM synthesizer, an MPE Alchemy, and all for $30 on a Mac. So it's very hard to argue with that,
That's a great point, because as you were talking about it, I realized I don't necessarily want a sound engine built into the instrument, but what I would like is something that says, here's the sound component that is the right match for this interface, And I think what you just did was kind of point out that there are a number of options, and any of those options may be the thing that speaks to you. Because I guess maybe in one way, leaving those options open also gives you the ability to serve many musical masters, right? Because I may really badly want drumming kinds of sounds, where the next person may want to do Hoover-style rave synths, and the person after that wants to simulate a cello. And not tying the device to anything specific gives all these people the ability to think that you made it for them. Right.
Well, in truth, I would like to have a single plugin that does tons and tons of stuff that I could ship with each unit. So what I do instead, I have a very nice downloadable project file for either Logic or MainStage that takes advantage of those wonderful synths that are built into both of those programs, right, and for such a low price. And they're all MPE sounds. Now I have some sounds also for other synths, but the most extensive set of sounds I have currently are those ones for Logic and MainStage.
Sure. Interesting.
But I also have, if you buy any of the sample modeling instruments that are all traditional sounds of wind or bowed string instruments, each one of them has a setup button that says Linstrument defaults, and it'll set it up perfect for Linstrument.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't realize that was happening, because prior to that, if you had something that did have some expressiveness, you'd always have to sort of like co-opt the breath controller or something like that. But what you're able to do now is get people to actually embrace the instrument as a specific input device.
Yeah, and one thing I should mention too is that as important as MPE is, Linstrument actually works very well with one-channel synths. And if you think about it, if you're doing very expressive work, like a violin or cello or the equivalent in synthesized sound, you're usually playing single lines. Mm-hmm. So, and in fact, it's hard to play too expressively with more than one expressive voice, But what we do in Linstrument, and Garrett wrote this wonderful software that just is so elegant how it does it. If you're playing a single voice, Linstrument has a one-channel mode. You can either play on one channel or in the MPE mode where it uses multiple channels, one for each voice, one for each note you're playing. But if you're in one channel mode and you're just playing a monophonic line, you're getting your full dimensions. Mm-hmm. You have either channel pressure or polypressure for your Z-axis, your note pressure, and then you slide your finger left to right, and that's just pitch bend method, just standard vanilla MIDI. And then forward-backward movement, the Y-axis, is sent by this agreement we have, and which Lipple started, of using CC74, right? So it's very straightforward. But what we do in the instrument is that the problem, of course, you've only got one pitch bend for the whole channel. So, for example, if I were holding a chord and then I would slide a note somewhere else, it would slide the entire chord that I'm playing as well. Well, what we do is, if you're only playing one note, the slide is completely continuous. If you're holding any other notes, the slide is stepped in semitones.
Oh, so you actually regenerate notes then on the fly.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is, if you're only holding a chord and vibratoing a solo note, it still vibratos it.
Right.
Because the vibrato, it will just vibrato the whole chord. And it actually sounds very musical.
Sure.
So when you slide up, you still got the movement within the cell, but it's just stopping that bend when it gets to the next note. and you can even
That's
play
cool.
chords and vibrato the chords. Like here's I'm playing a pedal steel here. And then if I just go to hold one note down, it just steps up.
Right.
So it works very well within one channel.
Mm-hmm.
So you can play chords and still get expressiveness.
Interesting. So, I know you're still really actively tweaking the Linn instrument into what you hope for it to be, but I'm curious, what's the next thing inside of your head? What's the next master move? What's the next rock star thing that you're going to do?
Well, I haven't really decided yet. I would like to make another drum machine because very frequently people say, make another drum machine. I mean, they like Tempest, but there's a lot of people that wanted to live in the sampling world, right, as opposed to the Tempest world. And the Linn instrument technology is wonderful for drum beats. So I've got here... I've got here... I've got pitch bends for each drum independent. Now watch this. If I tilt forward, but it's on my site. There's an 8-minute overview video that includes the drum beats. But basically, for each notepad, there it is.
Is it the tilt? Is it the tilt that's doing the filtering?
Yeah, what I'm doing is when I tilt my finger forward, then it becomes a pressure-controlled filter.
Ah, nice. Okay.
So that's using the built-in swing arpeggiator. So it's great for creating very funky beats.
Oh,
and
cool.
The lowest row is set to be a control strip, and what this is doing is changing the speed of the arpeggiator. So I can do fills like this. It actually works great as a drum machine, but I would like to take that into a form factor that would be more suitable for drum machinists, and with the sounds built in and the whole deal.
Right. Very cool. Well, Roger, I want to thank you so much for taking this time out of your schedule. I know you're a busy guy, but it's been fantastic. I learned an awful lot about you, and I've also been inspired by many of the things you said. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, thanks for giving me free publicity, which is my favorite kind.
All right. So with that, then I will say good night. Again, I appreciate you taking the time, but I also appreciate you giving some demo and also being willing to talk about history. I always enjoy hearing about that as well.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
All right. With that, I'll say goodbye. Bye.
Okay. Good to talk to you, Darwin.
Wow. Cool information. Cool discussion. It's great to hear not only Roger's development process, but where he sees things going in the future. I want to thank specifically you, the listeners, for sticking with me and enjoying these podcasts, and particularly in this case, Synthtopia. Synthtopia.com is working with me in a collaborative effort on getting the voices of people involved in the MPE MIDI spec and expressive controllers. And I hope that you really enjoy what these people have to say. These are the people that are on the bleeding edge of developments in the MIDI world, and I think that it's important for us all to hear where they're coming from and why they're doing the work that they're doing. So thank you so much. Again, if you want to read this podcast, or if you want to search through the contents looking for something, you can check it out on synthtopia.com. They have a transcription of this interview there. Otherwise, we will see you next week. Bye.